Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we discuss communication skills, leadership, diversity, and how you can show up as a leader and become visible and valued. Before I get on to my guest today, I'd like to invite you to see where your presentation skills are strong by taking our free 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can find out where your presentation skills are strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could get you the results you need. My guest today is Alaina Kupec, who was one of my early guests on the first year of Speakers Who Get Results, where we talked about gender perception in corporate America. This is in 2023. And as we are recording this, America is dealing with a lot of right-wing pushback against transgender people specifically. And so I asked Alaina to come back and talk to us about the business case for supporting your transgender employees and how do you manage if you are living in a state that has these restrictive rules, not just LGBTQ discrimination, but also people who need abortions or racism or any of that. Alaina's bio is extensive, and I'll put the whole thing in the show notes. The highlights are Alaina Kupec currently serves as the Senior Director of Portfolio Strategy and Analytics at Gilead Sciences, and she leads the Portfolio Strategy and Analytics team for the company's virology and inflammation issues. She leads a team that works across Gilead to enable asset and portfolio optimization for the company's development of new therapies. Prior to that, she was in global value and access and focused on new medicines that the company is developing to treat inflammatory conditions. During the unprecedented pandemic time, she also led the value and access work in the US and all ex-EU countries for remdesivir, which was Gilead's treatment for COVID-19, is Gilead's treatment for COVID-19. Her work ensured that new medicines will fit an unmet need for patients in a way that improves upon existing medicines that are already in the market, while ensuring that it's affordable and accessible for patients and governments around the world. When first joining Gilead, Alaina was head of market access for the inflammation therapeutic area at Gilead and was responsible for coordinating the access strategy in the US for all inflammation products. Before coming to Gilead in 2018, Alaina spent a long career with Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, and where she had roles in access, sales leadership, public affairs, and communications. Over the course of her career, she has used her strategic and tactical skills to analyze complex challenges with variables across different markets, to make assessments, develop strategy and tactics, and then lead the implementation of her work. She's a collaborative leader who focuses on ways to engage and meet stakeholder needs. Now, outside of her workplace, Alaina is a tireless advocate for the transgender community. She's a decorated Navy veteran, and in 2016, she was living very quietly in North Carolina with her spouse when the North Carolina legislature passed the now infamous bathroom bill called HB 2. This was a bill that required that anyone who used a bathroom had to use the bathroom that coordinated with the gender they were assigned at birth, not necessarily the gender they are now. It was then that Alaina made the decision to be public about her status as a woman who happens to be transgender, helping to bring awareness and education about what it means for one to be transgender. Alaina has also appeared in articles for Rolling Stone and Salon and was featured in a video that Out Leadership used at their 2016 summit in New York City, as well as an online video for the Raleigh, North Carolina News and Observer. She has also spoken at multiple press events. Alaina and her wife endowed a transgender positive collection at North Carolina State University. And in doing so, they hope it can help students, faculty, and parents of transgender children, and importantly, anyone who has an interest in learning, understanding, and researching what it means to be transgender. We had a fascinating conversation. I know you'll enjoy it. On to the interview with Alaina Kupec. Alaina Kupec, my friend, welcome back to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm so happy to have you back here.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. It's so great to see you again and be back.
Well, I have a lot to ask you today, but before I get into that, let me ask you, who would be your dream interview? If you could speak to someone who is not ordinarily available to you, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
You know, for me, it would be Pope Francis.
Okay.
I was raised Catholic. I still consider myself Catholic. It's been very trying since my gender transition 10 years ago, given some of the Catholic Church's beliefs around somebody who's transgender. But I was very, very early in my transition when Pope Francis became Pope. And one of the things that I heard, one of the very first things I heard him say was, when he was asked about the LGBT community, was what are his thoughts were. And he said, "Who am I to judge? That's not for me to judge." And I think that through the last 10 years, that has always stood by me at my core, because I think that that's so true in these very trying times that we face right now, with a lot of, I think, challenges to my very own community. As people passing judgment and making laws and banning things, and not only my community, but other communities, is I always go back to that. At the end of the day, there's one person who's going to judge me, and in my belief, that's God. And I live my life in a way that treats others around me with love and compassion, no matter what background they are, what their faith is. And it's a live and let live. And I think that the Pope has done an amazing job in a very challenging time for the church. And I think that he's faced a lot of pressure within the church to not necessarily exhibit that compassion for all, that they're trying to change an organization that size, and in a way that's been very, I think, aligned against particularly the LGBT community. He's faced a lot of pushback for doing that. And so, in many ways, what he's trying to do with the Catholic Church is what CEOs have to do for their companies, right? How do you navigate very challenging times and make sure the organization is moving the way you want it to go without alienating all your constituents along the way?
Okay.
So, yeah.
That would be a great interview. Absolutely. Let me go on to the questions I have for you. I am very careful to not go into politics most of the time in this show, but we live in the real world, and politics affects who we are, where we are, and how, and the situations that our companies are in. It's not all just on the internet, irrespective of what country you're in or what state you're in. We are recording this in May 2023, where there's a big resurgence again of anti-Semitism, racism, and especially legislation against transgender people lesbians, gay, bi, LGBTQ plus, but particularly specifically against transgender people. And especially led by Ron DeSantis, the current governor of Florida, who's positioning himself to run for president. You live in Florida. So I thought this would be a really good time to check in with you and ask you, what are you seeing living in that state where Ron DeSantis is banning human rights for everybody? What are you noticing? What do you see?
Just actually yesterday afternoon is when Governor DeSantis signed that legislation into law. And
which one?
Basically the expansion of the Don't Say Gay bill, also the one that bans gender affirming care for children, as well as a bathroom ban in public universities and schools for people who are transgender, public government-owned buildings. And so last night was very difficult emotionally for not only myself, but for my wife, who has been by my side for the last 10 years that we've been together and since I transitioned. And it's been very demoralizing and very tiring. I think that the more it just confirms that there is no merit to any of these bills. There's no substance to any of them. These are all pieces of legislation that really at the end of the day the only thing they do is they stigmatize an already marginalized and at-risk community for no public benefit whatsoever. It's all basically smoke and no fire, because if you look at the issues that are really behind here and gender affirming care for children aren't receiving surgeries. That doesn't happen. Public bathrooms and trying to, it's this new law.
So for our international listeners, can you define what the bathroom bill is? We've seen this before. This came around in previous years.
Well, just my luck. I lived in North Carolina when they passed the famous bathroom bill. And so I now have a cloud that follows me in states where I go to, that apparently bathroom bills are passed into law.
And what is a bathroom bill for our international listeners?
So a bathroom bill basically says someone like who's transgender, has to use the bathroom to my gender assigned at birth. So in my case, being a woman who's transgender, having been assigned male at birth, if I was to go into a school or a university, basically I would be breaking the law by going into a women's restroom now. Mm-hmm. And, it's under the guise of protecting people from, men in women's rooms. They never talk about, the fact that it's just not when women, there's trans men and trans women. But it's all about, protecting children and protecting people from the menace. And what you're looking at here, I'm the menace that they're talking about. So, the irony is, here in Florida, I'm not out. I'm not out to my neighbors across the street. I've lived here 2 years. Being transgender is a small part of who I am. It's not what I am. Mm-hmm. And that's the case for 99.9% of people who are transgender. You would never know. So all of these things are efforts to stoke up a political base on an issue that at its surface, people can identify with and say, well, yes, I don't want a man in a woman's room. Mm-hmm. But then if you look at me, hopefully you think, well, that's not a man I'm looking at. And they've also codified here in Florida what it means to be a man and a woman as what basically reproductive capability you have at birth. And so basically, if you were a man, you had the ability to produce sperm at birth. And this is literally how they're defining it in the law. And if you're a female at birth, and you had the potential to, you had eggs at birth. So they've tried to basically codify and simplify gender as a binary that's immutable. And science tells us that that's flat out wrong. It's much more complex than that. There are people who are intersex. There are people who have disorders. And being transgender is a medical condition recognized as such by every reputable medical association across the world.
Mm-hmm.
We only have these very fringe anti-transgender groups who try to define it differently. And so I think, to go back to the question you asked, I think that it's horrifying for people here in Florida. I think the sad thing is people are becoming numb to it. I think
Mm-hmm.
people, not only in Florida, but other states, just sort of see this extremism as, politics at its worst, and
Mm-hmm.
politicians trying to appeal to a very small, narrow base. And it's unfortunate because elected officials hopefully are there to lead all, not just a select minority of people that might be the most fervent part of their base.
Right.
And I think that, if you look at the record of Governor DeSantis before he ran for governor and what he ran on his first term, he was very he basically said these issues were not a problem. They were distractions that they shouldn't be focused on. But now that he's going to plan to announce his run for presidency next week, he's elevating these things because he thinks it's going to score him political points.
Yeah.
Which is exactly the same thing that we see across the country. These are all bills, not at the end of the day, they're going to do anything to protect the general public in any way whatsoever. But what they're going to do is ultimately lead to depression and suicide in the transgender community, and especially young transgender people who are already at risk. 40% of homelessness are in the LGBT community, and the majority of those are transgender who have been kicked out of their house by their families. And why does that happen? It's because of this stigmatization by politicians who try and other us and make us feel less than, instead of embracing the unique individuality that all of us bring and recognizing that there is a biological root in people who are transgender. And if you talk to the world's experts, and every reputable academic medical center across this country has experts in this field now, whether you're talking about Mayo Clinic, whether you're talking about Mount Sinai in New York, whether you're talking about Duke University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, UCLA, every reputable medical center in this country recognizes this as a medical condition. The only people who don't are the politicians who are really using this as a wedge issue to bring attention to themselves and their campaigns.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking about since we've been talking about this, I've been thinking a lot. I am old enough, you and I are both old enough to remember various cycles of, there was President Clinton and the Don't Ask, Don't Tell bill about gays in the military. And then there was a big thing about whether gays could get married. And then the early bathroom bills in North Carolina, which actually damaged the economy of North Carolina. One thing I've been thinking about is it's been part of the conspiracy theory playbook for quite some time to threaten children. And one of the things that the Russians do and have been doing for years is if there's somebody that the big boss doesn't like, not going to say his name here, but if there's somebody that the big boss doesn't like, they're accused of being a pedophile. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of where QAnon started. That says, these Democrats eat children. Eat children for breakfast, that can eat babies for breakfast. It's crazy, but it is an issue that you can run on when people are afraid.
Well, it's an issue. You pick on children because they can't fight back. Mm-hmm. They have no voice in the political arena. They can't vote. They can't hurt you politically, and they don't have a forum to fight back.
Well, actually, I was thinking about picking on marketing to parents to protect the children.
Well, exactly. But at the end of the day, who they're picking on are children who are relying on their parents to fight that fight. Mm-hmm. And that's, in the last 10 years since I've been public and transitioned, I have spoken with so many parents of children. And oftentimes these are parents who probably politically aligned Republican in the past. And they've heard this narrative that everybody's hearing across the country right now. And then their child comes out to them and they love their child unconditionally, but they're mortified because now they see the world that their children are going to grow up in. And they are so scared for what their children are going to face, the bullying and the rejection. And the irony is, if you're talking to people 32, 33 and below, they all get this. They embrace, this is a non-issue for them. And so the children amongst their peers are going to be fine. But it's the fear of how the adults are going to treat their children that comes out in my discussions with them. It's what are the politicians going to do? How is the world going to be cruel to their child? Are they going to have the ability to grow up as a normal child? And it's all driven by the bullying on the adult side. And sadly, I think that it's hard to get those voices heard through the public dialogue right now. And I think that that's one of the challenges, quite honestly.
Well, and you can't, nowadays, you're not supposed to go out and say something bad of somebody with another skin color. But because that has been normalized enough, and enough people have pushed back to say this is not good. We don't want this. That now, but you could say that about trans people. Nowadays, a lot of people know gay people, so you can't say it so much about gay people because my uncle is gay, or my brother, or my coworker. But you can still say it about trans people because so few people know somebody. I'm going to get to the business case for this in a minute, but I want to ask you another sociological question. So I think in terms of historical cycles, that's one of the things that 30 years in the opera business did for me was, spending 30 years with the literature of everything from Roman literature to the 18th and 19th centuries makes me look at historical cycles. One wonders how these issues were dealt with before it came out, maybe a century ago or 2 centuries ago. And I'm curious if you've had any thoughts about that.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, transgender people have always existed. If I say the name Joan of Arc, I wonder what comes to people's minds. If you think back to Joan of Arc, I don't know how they identified whatsoever, but Joan of Arc was in many ways gender nonconforming, right? She didn't fit the stereotype of the gender norms at that time. If you look at the physical descriptions of her, that's probably one of the historical figures that I'd point back to and say, she was revered for what she did, but she didn't fit that social norm. I also happen to be part Native American and part Cherokee. And in the Native American community, people who are transgender are considered enlightened. They're called two-spirits. In the Hawaiian culture, it's the same way. And so in many other cultures outside of the white Christian culture, people who are transgender are actually seen in a very different and oftentimes positive way, because we do have a unique perspective. I lived and operated and navigated this world the best I could for the first 40 years of my life as a white man and had white male privilege. I know what that looks like. I felt that. I experienced that. Well, I will tell you that I didn't know what I was feeling and experiencing at the time, and really until I lost it. And then it became very, very clear to me what it was that I had. And so it's not something that a white
you lost it by claiming your true identity and looking to the outside world like a woman.
Exactly. Nobody in their right mind makes the choice to give up the positional power of a white man. But I had to be true to myself and be authentic to myself. And I could no longer live that lie to myself and to those that I loved and who were around me, my children and my family. And I knew that was to come with great sacrifice. But it's opened my eyes in so many ways to the challenges of living and working and navigating this world as a woman is completely different than a man, much less a white man. And so I think that so much of what we're seeing in this country for the last probably 7 years has been this fear of many white men losing that traditional positional power that they've held within the society. And these, whether it's this legislation we're talking about in Florida or other bills like in other states, it's the racism we're seeing, the anti-Semitism that we're seeing, the anti-immigration rhetoric we're seeing. All of those are manifestations of white male power being put on a level playing field, and people being that fear of giving something up.
Yeah.
And there is, at the end of the day, the irony is there's no fear to be had there. The world's a better place when we can just love and embrace each other for who we all are, and accept that there's beauty in our differences, and not be so caught up in, the things that we may enjoy because of the societal status that has traditionally been passed down from generation to generation in this country for the last 200 years. But I think that, with progress comes the setbacks, and that's what we're experiencing right now, are the setbacks. I think, you could look back at the Obama administration. You had a Black American president. And I think a lot of things started after we had a Black American president. And some of this is that whiplash of, I think, the country having pushing back against that. And so you make steps forward, there's going to be steps back. The question in my mind is, how long are we going to continue to step back? And can we weather this storm until we can come out the other side? And I'm an optimist. I believe that at the end of the day that we will, and that even here in Florida, where we're living through these challenging times in my community, that we will weather this storm. We will come out stronger on the other side. And to the point that you made about visibility, it's so challenging because, as you mentioned, the transgender community is so small. The visible transgender community is even smaller. So for every person that you may see like me on this podcast, there's probably 7 or 8 other people who are transgender who may be living like I was up until 10 years ago, in the closet, scared to come out. I know professionals who are airline pilots, who are in the finance business, all kinds of people who hide who they are because they're so scared to accept who they are. And they find ways to express themselves in private because they fear losing their career. They fear losing their marriage. They fear losing their children. And so that's one of the reasons why I made the decision to be visible, in North Carolina during the bathroom bill there, is if people don't have the opportunity to see someone like me and know and look at me and hear my lived experience, then the narrative that they're going to have when they think of transgender people is what they hear from the politicians. And I'm hoping to do my part to, be visible in an appropriate way that people can say, well, that law makes no sense. It would be crazy to have Alaina go to a men's restroom. When I was living in North Carolina after they passed that bathroom bill, I met with several Republican lawmakers who supported that legislation. And I sat across from them, and I'll always remember this. And they said, well, one of them said to me, well, I would never have a problem with you using a woman's bathroom. And I said, well, that's the problem. You've now legislated it that it's illegal for me to do that. They haven't reconciled what they have voted for and then what it actually means in people's lives. It's just that disassociation is so crazy. So that's why I'm hoping to do my part to put a face on really what it means to be transgender. And it's no different than any other medical condition. It's a medical condition that there's medical treatments that appropriate medical experts in this field are trained to treat. And so how we can deny people appropriate medical care is beyond me, much less children who are really only getting psychotherapy and potentially puberty blockers that will delay their puberty until they can get to the age of consent and make an informed decision for themselves. It does nothing to reverse anything about them. In fact, at the end of the day, they're going to be surgical sparing, because if you go through puberty and then you transition, you have to have a number of surgeries to undo the effects of estrogen or testosterone, depending on the way you're transitioning. And that's going to require a lot of expensive surgery. So in many ways, those puberty blockers are surgical sparing. So why would we deny people appropriate psychological care and the ability to just pause and get to the age of consent and make an informed decision? Again, it's a boogeyman that's being used for political gain that's not based in really anything that's real or tangible in this world.
So let's go to the business case here. There are some people, usually entitled white people, who say, why should we bother with diversity, equity, and inclusion? Why can't everybody just be okay? And why does it matter that diversity, equity, and inclusion there is now no one teaching that in the schools in Florida, the schools and the universities? That's the first question. Why does that matter? And what should we do?
Well, I think that matters because companies and corporations are made up of people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, experiences. If we don't have the resources available for people to recognize that if somebody who is non-white, what we're essentially saying to those people is there's one view of the world, it's the white world. Mm-hmm. And the resources, the white straight world, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think that schools are places of knowledge and learning. If we don't have the ability for children to have resources that help them understand who they are, and again, who they are, I'm not talking about gender, I'm talking about having appreciation for their own history, their own mm-hmm. culture, and we don't expose people to other cultures, then what we're saying is that one culture is better than all the others, and the other ones are worth learning about. And so I think that that's the scary part, is there's a conscious effort to stamp out diversity mm-hmm. here in Florida and other states. And I think that has a damning effect on, if you're somebody who is a minority in any way, what that means to you and your ability to feel seen and heard and valued in your mm-hmm. everyday life and in your growth and your development as well.
So one of the things that we were talking about earlier is as a company, how can you help families who, say, need to move to another state to protect a child, for instance?
Well, I think that's where these issues, like the ones in Florida, really hit home, and Texas is the same. And it's not only the transgender affirming care for children, it's the abortion issue and other issues that have, been dividing the country for the last several years, right? These issues hit home for companies because what do you do in those cases where you have employees working in a state where they don't have access to care? That hopefully companies have policies that are supportive of that care. Mm-hmm. And so it's a financial and I think a real issue for retention with those companies. Mm-hmm. And so do you pay for that colleague's move to a state where their transgender child can grow and thrive and be valued for who they are, not what they are? Do you provide transportation to people who need to access medical care in a different state? Whether that's transgender affirming care or abortions or any other types of care, right? So, I think that's where companies are at a crossroads right now. Mm-hmm. They're in some ways having to make choices around what's best for their business and best for their colleagues, may be sometimes in opposition to each other. Because mm-hmm. companies are oftentimes reticent to take a public stand mm-hmm. because they don't want to get drawn into a political fight. And if you look at the Walt Disney Company here in Florida and the battle that's going on with the governor here in the special tax district, and them stripping the special tax district away from Walt Disney Company, who spoke out against the Don't Say Gay bill, it had a very damning effect, not only for Disney, but for other companies who are already resident to put their toe in the water publicly to support their colleagues, to say, we see you, we value you, LGBT community that works for Walt Disney Company, and we're going to support you. By doing that publicly, they faced a very real backlash that's affected their earnings statements, right? Mm-hmm. And so, companies and boardrooms are trying to wrestle with how do they navigate these very challenging political waters where you're trying to really support and take care of the people that are the heart of your business, you hope, at the same time, do so in a way that doesn't bring backlash to your bottom line as a company. And so I think that in boardrooms across the country, this has been a discussion now for the past 5 or 6 years, in many ways, since these bathroom bills first started in 2016. I think it was the first time that this kind of was put on the radar. And then with Roe versus Wade being overturned, it was brought to the forefront yet again. And now, you're seeing companies like the Walt Disney Company here in Florida fighting back and suing for corporate free speech. But companies don't want to be in the business of doing that. They want to be in the business of...
You're not the size of Disney, and you don't have Disney's financial resources.
No, you don't want to be in the business. You want to be in the business of, helping to satisfy the customers that you have as a company, not in a battle of protecting First Amendment rights for companies' free speech, right? And so it's a paradox that I think is a really interesting to see how companies are navigating it at the moment. And I'm seeing on my side a very deliberate and conscious effort, pulling the word diversity out of anything companies do.
Yes.
And so that's the other thing is, at least from what I have seen, nobody in our initiatives from the human resources any longer, the word diversity is not used very much. It's all about inclusion.
And tell us, and actually this is an important point. Tell us why you can't just say inclusion, why you have to say diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging. This is important.
My personal perspective is inclusion applies to everyone, right? We should all be inclusive. But when I hear inclusion as a woman who happens to be transgender, to me, it strikes me as all lives matter.
All lives matter
doesn't recognize the crises that some people are going through and the support and the need to lift up and focus on Black equity, for example. Black equity and inclusion in this country is a big issue that's been pushed behind the scenes right now.
Let me just interject here for our international listeners that all lives matter was something that some politicians said we should say instead of Black lives matter, which devalued what the Black Lives Matter protesters were saying. If you say all lives matter, then that means we just go back to the same old system.
Exactly.
And so not recognizing how much harder you have to work if you are Black or gay or trans or Latino or Asian or any neurodivergent, any of the minorities that we are now recognizing and accepting, lumping it into all lives matter just means that the same power structure just takes us back to the same old power structure.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Elizabeth. And that's why, here in Florida, they have banned diversity training being done by companies. Companies can no longer do diversity training in the state of Florida. And the government has banned any diversity training at schools and universities. So, they've made the word diversity taboo. You can't do it, or else you're going to face legal repercussions for doing so. You could be fired from your job if you're a public educator and you talk about diversity. And so I think that's the resulting impact of this, is, as you mentioned, is, we can talk about inclusion, but it's a triangle. It's a three-legged stool. If you take away the other legs of that stool, it falls upon itself. And I think that's the challenge, and that's what we're seeing right now. Is, I think, for all the growth that we had as a company and country, and coming together and recognizing the value of diversity and inclusion, now we're seeing a strong push towards stifling that and putting it back in the closet as something that's bad, because again, it goes back to those that have traditionally held power and that effort to hold on to that power,
which is ultimately destined to fail, but it's painful going through it. So, Alaina, this has been fascinating and important. And if you are, say you're a manager or a director or in the leadership of your company, what can you do safely without damaging the company?
I think it's show your allyship through visible signs, words, and actions. So I think the biggest thing you can do is be an ally, be a visible ally that people can see. And that's for all communities, right? Black, Latino, LGBT. It's through words and actions. Visible demonstrations of support are critical. And I think it can be easy to take for granted that maybe you can think that, oh, people know I'm an ally. They don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They these are turbulent times and very changing times. And I don't think anybody takes for granted who may have been an ally in the past, that they're still an ally today. Mm-hmm. And so whether it's through words, actions, or signs, I think making sure that people know that you're empathetic to the situations that they may be in. I think that acknowledging that in mm-hmm. one-on-one discussions with direct reports, checking in with people, asking them, how are you doing? Mm-hmm. It may be a tough time right now, but how are you doing? How are you holding up? Mm-hmm. And again, we don't want to interject politics into the workplace, but open up a dialogue with colleagues and just check in with them. And, whether it's putting up, we're getting ready to go into Pride Month, putting a pride mm-hmm. flag as a background on a remote Zoom teleconference, mm-hmm. Or putting a pride flag in your office somewhere, or something that says, I'm an ally. Mm-hmm. I think that, small things like that are so important. And no matter how small you may think they are, they mean so much to us that maybe come from marginalized communities.
Well, and another thing is, if your company has employee resource groups, I hope they do, then visit employee resource groups for people who don't look like you.
Yes, exactly. Take the opportunity to
sponsor if you can, but visit at least.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, I always remember a conversation that I had when I was walking out of my office years ago. And I was talking to a white male colleague, and I had talked about an employee resource group, and they said, well, what's that? Uh-huh. They had no idea what an employee resource group even was.
Right.
And so if you work at a company, you probably see invitations for lunch and learns or educational sessions for these different employee resource groups. Take the time to join one of those and learn and, pay attention to the messages being heard, but also take a look at that list of people who are there and see if you know people that are in those meetings, or do you see people if their meetings are live? And, have that conversation and talk about what you saw or heard at that meeting and tie it back to a conversation you can have with a colleague that shows them you not only were there, but you listened and learned from that too. Mm-hmm. I think that's critically important.
I should actually, again, define what an employee resource group is for those who don't know, is a group, say, of the Black employees in your organization, or the Latinx, or the gay employees, or the veterans. You and I first met through a veterans employee resource group. It's where people of similar backgrounds can get together and talk about what their experience is. And if that's not your background, you will learn a lot. Go and listen.
Yes.
It's also, it's a good way to get visible. So as a little plug from my career development work, which is be one of the people who leads an employee resource group that fits who you are, so that you can, because that's a good way to meet the upper management who come to listen in. Then they know who you are. You're not invisible. You become a visible person.
Exactly. And seek out mentors within those employee resource groups. It's a great way to find mentors and to find people that have experiences that you can learn from, that are outside of your traditional, maybe leadership tree. And so it's a safe place for people to broaden their social network within the company, at the same time learning. And I have nothing but great things to say about them. I have long said that within my own company, that they're one of the secret sauces of the culture. And a company that has a strong employee resource group base, it's a sign of health for a company. And the company's willingness to really empower those and fund the work that they do it's a very telltale sign of their real commitment to, how they view their employees and then how they view diversity within their corporations as well.
Well, and diversity is not just this would be nice to do for those little people over there. Statistics have shown over and over and over that if you have diverse voices, especially in the leadership of the company, the profits go up. There's study after study after study that shows us that the profits go up if you have diverse voices, because you may miss something if you're only talking to people who look and think like you.
Exactly. You need it. We can all benefit from a diversity of thought. Mm-hmm. And so I think that if we all bring something different to the table, we can solve problems in different ways that we could never solve if we just had one way of thinking.
That's a great way, a great line to end on. Alaina Kupec, thank you so very much for being a guest on Speakers Who Get Results. Listeners, if you enjoyed this, follow us, subscribe to us on YouTube, tell your friends, subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you listen, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That's the one that matters. And follow us, tell your friends. We've loved having you listen to this. Thank you so much, Alaina Kupec, for joining me today. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.